By our calculations here, we believe that this could still be taken to police. Would you give us your thoughts on that and the choice to go the civil route and any other information you think that's pertinent to this discussion, please, Bob?
Yeah, I do believe that the statute of limitations has in fact been extended. Sometimes these things can be a little bit tricky. So from my understanding from doing some of the research and reading some of the people that practice in New York, there is a viable claim that can be brought now. But that's one thing. The idea of, well, bring a criminal charge is kind of, to me, a false statement that's being made there, or a duplicitous one. The woman is not a person who brings criminal charges. The police and prosecutors are the ones that bring criminal charges, and we don't know right now whether or not, in fact, the federal government or the state government is, in fact, investigating criminal charges. So what I find to be odd is if I were representing Jay-Z, I certainly would not be out there from a standpoint of the court of public opinion getting into the dirt with regard to these allegations, number one. But when I first heard him say, well, why don't you file criminal charges, everyone knows, including the lawyer, including all of your guests here, including yourself, the victim doesn't file the criminal charges here, it's the prosecutor. So if the statute of limitations is viable still, then he is at risk here. And by the way, everything that he's doing and every comment that he's making, if he is at risk, prosecutors are watching like I did when I was a prosecutor, because I would love in high-profile cases with people who felt the need that they had to speak to the court of public opinion, they were actually hurting themselves criminally.
Bob, let me begin with you, please. Your thoughts on whether or not that criminal verdict is going to affect things in the civil case.
The criminal verdict will have absolutely no significance whatsoever in the civil case. Think O.J. Simpson. You can be acquitted in a criminal case where the standard is proof beyond a reasonable doubt, as opposed to in a civil case where the standard is much lower by a preponderance of the evidence, and the laws are very, very different. Simple negligence or assault can be actionable under civil, where in criminal, what you have to prove is much more significant, and you have to prove it to 12 jurors. So the two really don't intersect with one another. The question is going to be whether or not a civil jury will look at this any differently than the criminal jury did after a lot of deliberation, review of the evidence, asking to have readback and testimony as to whether or not the actions of the victim, quote unquote, in this case were substantially justified the use of force by the defendant. But the two may be very different. You may have an O.J. scenario here. We'll have to wait and see.
Bob, let me go back to you on what the prosecutors did after the second deadlock that was noted. For the court said to the judge, we move to dismiss these charges. The court didn't, or charge rather, the charge of manslaughter. The court did in fact dismiss that charge. So then they just considered the criminally negligent homicide charge. That's all that was left. I'm curious, and I know you were a homicide prosecutor for many years. I'm curious if you think there was an overcharging here. Should they have just charged the criminally negligent homicide from the outset?
Well, you asked the million-dollar question that prosecutors look at all the time. First off, prosecutors should not be overcharging as a tactical decision in order to try to work a case out. Now, I know that there's a school of thought out there that if you overcharge, then you give the jury the opportunity to say, well, I'm not going to go guilty on the highest charge, I'm going to go to the lower charge. But I don't think that that's the way prosecutors should operate, and certainly when I was a homicide prosecutor, I didn't operate that way. I charge based on what I believe the facts could prove beyond the reasonable doubt with respect to the actual charge itself, and I'll tell you why. Because when you're in front of a jury and you're a prosecutor, one of the most important things you can do, in addition to having your evidence presented correctly and proof beyond a reasonable doubt, is your credibility as an attorney.
Credibility.
And when you go in there with an overcharge, you're hurting yourself.
Bob, I got to jump in here because we're just about out of time, but you're right. Credibility is key. If you don't have that, what do you have in front of a jury? Mel, but you know that.